in terms of where we're at, so we introduced the latter prophets last week, and this week we're going to start with the first of four. I will be out of town next week, so Frank is actually going to do Daniel next week. A little bit out of order, but not too much out of order. And so Frank will cover Daniel, and then we'll rejoin the following week with Jeremiah and Lamentations. But this week we're going to study Isaiah. We're going to try to do it in 1 week. It's about 1.5, so it could go either way. But I'm going to try to do it this week. I think it's the best way. I'm going to go ahead and pray for us as we get started, and then we'll start studying Isaiah together. Lord, I thank you for your word. I thank you for already what we've learned. I thank you for the example of Paul and his companions, and God, how they trusted you, how they proclaimed your gospel even amidst opposition, and how they remained faithful to you through prison and even death in many cases. God, I thank you for that we have your word now, and that we have your gospel now, and that we can trust you and obey you because we know what you desire. Help us, God, to grow in that. Forgive us for the many times we fail you when we aren't following your word and we aren't trusting you. Father, we are very prone to wander and prone to stumble. Please help us to be more faithful to you. Help us to love you with all of our heart. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so we're gonna cover Isaiah, and just a little bit of, let me tell you where we're gonna go. That'd probably be the easiest way to do this. I'm just gonna talk a little bit about Isaiah as an author first. Tell you just briefly about the time period of the book of Isaiah, and then we're gonna walk through sort of the story of Isaiah, really high level. It's 66 chapters. So we'll do it in 7 sections and try to tell the story of Isaiah very high level. And then we'll talk through the themes and purpose statement for Isaiah. So that's the plan for today. And I think we should have plenty of time to do each of those. So let me start by talking a little bit about Isaiah. He's called the Prince of the Prophets for various reasons. One, he's kind of the first. He starts the prophets, the latter prophets. He's quoted from more than any other of the prophets. In fact, the most quoted part of the Old Testament is in Isaiah. What do you think that is? 53. Isaiah 53, the suffering servant. What do you think the second is in Isaiah? Quoted for very often. 9. Not 9. 7. That's what we think of probably for Christmas cards, and 7, but not even 7 or 9. 1. Not even 1. Think about what is Isaiah, what is one of the well-known events in his life in the book of Isaiah? Oh, Isaiah. Yeah, that's right. And particularly how he's going to go to Israel and they're not going to listen. And that's repeated several times, like at the end of Acts, for instance. Paul quotes it many times. So he's the Prince of Prophets, both because he heads the prophets, he's quoted from, he has a lot to say about the Messiah. We mentioned a lot of those just now. We mentioned last week, 2,200 different words in 66 chapters. That's 30 unique words per chapter, 33 unique words per chapter, many words that are never used anywhere else. He's just a master of language and poetry. For all those reasons, he's referred to as Prince of the Prophets. He was a prophet to, also I should mention, he did have a very long career. We'll see in just a second. He spanned 5 kings. So that's a long ministry that he had. Jewish tradition is that he was killed by Manasseh after the main part of his ministry was with Ahaz and Hezekiah, what we'll read about today. But after that, Jewish legend is that he was killed by Manasseh. Actually, legend is he was sawn in two, as it says in the book of Hebrews, but that's not been corroborated. That's just Jewish history. I mentioned how often he's quoted by the New Testament. He was a prophet to Judah and particularly to Jerusalem. He actually ministered the same time as Hosea. I put that up here so that you would see. He and Hosea had the same span in terms of kings. Hosea actually ministered. He had prophecies about both the northern and the southern kingdom. Isaiah was particularly focused on Judah and especially focused on Jerusalem, as we'll see. In fact, he had it seemed, an open door to the kings. You know, he was very often had individual conversations with the kings, unlike many other prophets who were focused on the people and the kings at times. He was very focused on the kings of Judah. And another Jewish tradition is that he was related to the kings by cousin. So Again, whether that's true or not, we don't know. But the fact is, he was really focused on the kings of Judah, on Jerusalem in particular. And it's going to be really the highlight of the book of Isaiah is going to be about two specific kings. Okay, just really briefly, we won't spend much time on this, but it's helpful to know is that there are very few people in scholarly circles that think Isaiah was written by Isaiah, in the same way that they don't believe that the book of the law was written by Moses. But there are a lot of reasons they say this. The primary reason is because Isaiah, like Daniel, prophesies of things to come. He names Cyrus 100 years. If it was truly Isaiah who wrote it, he named Cyrus 200 years before Cyrus came on the scene. And so it's easier to say, well, I don't think that's possible, so it must have been written afterwards and pretended to be a prophecy. And so that's just really quickly what people will say about it. There are really, really strong arguments against it. We won't cover the structure of the book. That's one argument against it. Certainly, the point of those prophecies is that God is different than anyone else. God knows the future, he can tell the future, and he can do it in advance. That's the point of the prophecies. So either you either say it's written afterwards and you don't believe God that he can do that, or you say God can do that, and that's the point of the prophecies. And then last, just like with Moses, Jesus consistently attributes this book to Isaiah. Not just the first half, because that's what they'll say. They'll say the first half, Isaiah wrote it, but the second half, which has the prophecies, he didn't write. The problem with that is there's prophecies in the first half, and Jesus quotes from the second half and attributes it to Isaiah. But we won't spend a ton of time on that. I just wanted to share that. So that's Isaiah as author. Now, the time period, we showed this slide last week, but we're particularly focused on the latter prophets right now, and there were four really big events. Do y'all remember them that they kind of congregate around? What were the four big events that the latter prophets all congregate around? The exile of both the northern kingdom in 722 and the southern kingdom in 586. That's two of them. And then Cyrus's decree that they could return was a big event around the latter prophets. And the last was the one that we'll cover today, which was the Assyrian invasion of Jerusalem in 701, and how the angel of the Lord came and defeated the Assyrians, killed 185,000 of them, and turned them away. So that's going to be really important for the book of Isaiah. So that is sort of where the latter prophets congregate around. I've got the kind of zoomed in on that. We are on the yellow here. So Isaiah and Hosea started in the glory, almost, I won't call it the glory days. The glory days were really Solomon, but of the divided kingdom, this was the glory days. You had a king in the north who reigned for about 40 years and a king in the south who reigned for about 50 years. They expanded their borders. They were kind of the strongest people in the region. It was sort of in between Egypt and Assyria. So there wasn't a strong superpower, and so life was really good for Israel and Judah here. But Assyria was building power, and things were going to change really soon. That's when Assyria took over the northern kingdom, destroyed them, exiled them, and eventually tried to do the same thing to Judah and Jerusalem. And this is where this is going to be very important to Isaiah in this book.
Did the Assyrians, I know that Jerusalem was protected, but did they...
They ravaged the land, yeah. So
the rest of Judah, did that
the rest of Judah.
After that?
So if you read like Isaiah 1, which is an introduction, it's not his call, but it's an introduction to where they're at. It says that, I just got to find the verse. Here it is, verse 7. Your land is desolate, your cities are burned with fire, your fields... Strangers are devouring them in your presence. It is desolation, as overthrown by strangers. And the daughter of Zion, which is Jerusalem, is left like a shelter in a vineyard, like a watchman's hut in a cucumber field, like a besieged city. So Assyria kind of destroyed everything. They ravaged all the towns. They came to Jerusalem. We'll get to Isaiah 8 in a bit. Isaiah 8, which talks about the Assyrians coming to do that, says that... Here we go. Therefore, behold, the Lord is about to bring on them the strong and abundant waters of the Euphrates, even the king of Assyria in all his glory. It will rise up over it, all its channels, go over all its banks. It will sweep on into Judah. It will overflow and pass through. It will reach even to the neck. What do you think the neck would be? What's the head? Yeah, Zion, Jerusalem's the head. It reaches all the way to the head, to the neck, and spread the wings, and the spread of its wings will fill the breadth of your land, O Emmanuel. So that's where Assyria is going to come all the way to Jerusalem, but Emmanuel was going to stop it, whatever that means, and we'll talk about that in just a second. So, yes, they destroyed most of... Kristen, can you help me hold the door for her? They destroyed almost all of Judah after carrying them to exile. But they didn't, after they got turned away, no, they still had another 100 years of living in the land and before Babylon came. So that's the time period. Again, we're focused on that aspect. Isaiah was much earlier than Babylon. So, Babylon's going to come later. We're going to have these of the 12. They're going to speak to that exile. Isaiah's not going to have as much to say about that. Okay, so let me just put these up here. So these are some, just helpful historical things to hang your thoughts on as we prepare to talk through the whole book. So Isaiah was around 740. Again, that was in that sort of glory time. Uzziah was the king that reigned for 50 years. Remember, he offered something in the temple and was struck with leprosy. So the last 10 years or so of his reign, he was a co-regent with his son Jotham. Ahaz came after Jotham, and Ahaz was a horrible king. There were 4 good kings in a row. Uzziah, Jotham, and Uzziah's father and grandfather were all kings who did right in the eyes of the Lord. But Ahaz came and changed all that after 4 generations of good kings. He was horrible. He had his son. We'll show you all the things he did in just a second, but passed his son through the fire, sacrificed his son, just committed horrible apostasy. He's the one that went to Syria and saw the altar in Syria and had a copy of it. He took what it looked like and sent it to his priests and had them remove the altar in the temple and put that one there, and had him remove the bronze sea with the oxen under. He just did horrible things in terms of both what he did with his family and what he did with worship. He just was a horrible king. He was the one he was a young guy when he started. He was about 16 years old, and really early in his reign, Assyria was starting to get strong. Assyria was beginning to encroach on Syria and Israel, the two kingdoms just north of Judah, and they didn't know what to do, so they said, we're going to have to all kind of band together to fight against Assyria. So, hey, let's go get Judah to join with us. And Judah was like, no, I'm not going to go with you. And they said, well, we're going to attack you, and we're going to put our own king there so that the 3 of us together can fight against Assyria. And so Ahaz had Syria and Assyria coming on his door when he was a young king, and that's going to be an important part of this story as well. So we'll talk about that when we get to Isaiah 7. What he does in response to that, just to tell the story quickly, is he calls on Assyria for help. He says, Assyria, hey, they're trying to get us all together so we can fight against you, and I'd rather give you money and you come take care of them for me. That's what Ahaz did, even though God said, don't do it. Just trust me. He did that. Hezekiah followed Ahaz. It's exact opposite. Just one of the best kings in all of Judah. Certainly I was trying to think. I don't know how you rank the kings of Judah. David is the one that's always compared to. Maybe Hezekiah, maybe Josiah are some of the best other kings that they ever had in their years as a kingdom. Hezekiah was a great king, and he was the one on the throne when Assyria came and the angel of the Lord destroyed the army of Assyria, 185,000, and saved Jerusalem. Okay, and then Isaiah wrote his book likely afterwards, before he was killed during the reign of Manasseh. That's the time period Isaiah's author. Now I want to talk about the story. We're going to just kind of high-level walk through the book as a whole. And the book is, I mentioned last week that when you think about the latter prophets, they're all kind of picking up the story that was left off of Kings. Kings showed, we're not going to have any more compassion on you. And God had no more compassion. He didn't save them. He didn't re-covenant with the people. He allowed them to be destroyed. We saw the prophets as the centerpiece of that. We thought he would renew covenant with them. They didn't. And the latter prophets come and say, yeah, God didn't have mercy. He refused to covenant again, but he is. One more time in the future, he's going to re-covenant with the people. And it's going to be a new covenant, and it's going to be different, like the ones before, but different. Because he's going to put his spirit in their hearts. He's going to forgive their sins. And that's what the latter prophets said. And there were 4 of them, and they each kind of focused on a different aspect of that. Isaiah, who? Jeremiah, what? Ezekiel, where? and the 12 when. So today, we're going to talk about the who. Like how is God going to do that? Who is going to be the one that serves to bring that covenant in? And he's going to do that by contrasting Ahaz and Hezekiah. The whole book's going to be structured around the contrast between Ahaz and Hezekiah. And as I mentioned, there's really almost nothing in common between them. So Ahaz, as I mentioned, sacrificed his son in the fire. Hezekiah, as soon as he began to reign, he started all kinds of reforms to get rid of that kind of stuff in Judah. For instance, the high places. Ahaz sacrificed on them. Hezekiah destroyed them. Even the good kings of Judah, they would say he was a good king. He did what David did, but he didn't get rid of the high places. They still sacrificed Israel. Well, Hezekiah got rid of those too. I mean, he was a really great king. Hezekiah destroyed the bronze serpent. You remember that in the days of Moses when they had to look on people had started worshiping that. Hezekiah destroyed that. Hezekiah went around and reformed. He even got people from the northern kingdom to come and worship in Jerusalem as a part of his reign. I mean, he's just a great king. So I mentioned how Ahaz really changed all the pattern of the temple and how things were put together in the temple. Hezekiah came back and re-cleansed it all, prepared it all, had a Passover unlike any before it. Ahaz, defeated by his enemies and was buried in an ignoble way. So I mean, he ended his life kind of how he began his reign. It was very a horrible reign. Unlike Hezekiah, who had great military victories and was buried with the nobility and was a king that was looked highly upon. So again, Isaiah is going to contrast these two in his book, and it's easy to do. There's just so much different between the two. Okay, so we're gonna find that Isaiah 36 to 39 is the centerpiece of the book, and that's where the contrast is going to come out, and the point of the book is going to be highlighted. Let me tell you just briefly about that. I mentioned earlier about when Ahaz was king, and Israel and Syria came down, and God said, "Trust me, I'm going to take care of this. You're not going to be harmed." Instead, he sent money to the Assyrians and paid them off. Well, Hezekiah was going to have a very similar situation where the Assyrians now are coming. They're surrounding the city, and now Hezekiah is going to be facing the same thing as his son did decades before. This is the centerpiece. It's the story of their deliverance. I mentioned it's an extremely important event in Israel's history. And it was prophesied by Hosea. Hosea said, God's no longer going to have compassion on the northern kingdom, but he is going to still have compassion on the southern, and he's going to save them, not by military power, but by his own strength. And that's what was prophesied by Hosea. The fulfillment of that was what God did in Jerusalem in 701. Okay, so let's talk through the book at a really high level. This is going to be the majority of what we do today, just to kind of give us a feel for the whole book. So, chapters 1 to 6, I already read from chapter 1 that talked about the desolation in Israel because of Assyria, how everything except for Jerusalem was that way. It also contains the call of Isaiah, as we mentioned, the second most quoted thing from the book of Isaiah, where Isaiah sees the Lord in his holiness, recognizes he's sinful. God forgives his sin, touches him with the burning censer on the tongue, and forgives his sin, and then commissions Isaiah to go to this people. And so that's the sort of introduction to the book. Now, chapter 7, we want to read some of this because this is a key part. I call it the foil. You guys know what a foil is in literary, in literature. It's the sort of person that's contrasted with the protagonist to try to tell the point of the story. So this is going to be a really important story for us to read through to understand the book of Isaiah. So Ahaz, we're going to turn to chapter 7 so that we can read through it together. We'll focus on this, and then we'll focus on the centerpiece of Isaiah, and the rest will hit at a very high level. So I'm going to read verse by verse, but I'll summarize a little as we go just to save on time. All right, chapter 7, verse 1, came about in the days of Ahaz that Pekah, the king of Israel, went up to wage war against Jerusalem. And Ahaz heard about it, verse 2, said, the Arameans have camped, and now he's really afraid. His heart and the hearts of the people all shook. And rightly so, because he had already been defeated by Edom and those northern kingdoms before. And now here they are at his back doorstep. So, Isaiah 7:3, Yahweh says to Isaiah, "Go meet Ahaz, you and your son, Shear-Jashub," which means a remnant will return. "Meet him at the end of the conduit of the upper pool on the highway to the fuller's field." And he essentially says to him, don't be afraid. These people are just like a match when you light it. It's going to go out before you can even count to 3. It's just going to, they appear like they have something, but it's just going to all dwindle out. They're not even going to be a people anymore very soon. Don't be afraid. And he says in verse 10, Yahweh spoke to Ahaz saying, "In fact, I want to encourage you to trust me in this. You can ask for any sign you want at all. And I will give you a sign, make it really miraculous, and I will give it to you." Ahaz said, "I'm not going to ask. I'm not going to test Yahweh." Very pious sounding, but in reality he was a very impious man and refused to listen to God, and had already made up his mind to send money to Assyria, so he didn't want to hear it. But Isaiah responds, "The Lord will give you a sign. Behold, a virgin will be with child and bear a son, and she will call his name Emmanuel. He's going to eat curds and honey, and at the time he knows enough to refuse evil and choose good. Before that, the land who the 2 kings you dread will be forsaken." So very short order, and these 2 kings are going to be forsaken. But he goes on to say, it will come about in that day, verse 18, "Yahweh will whistle for the fly that is in the remotest part of the rivers of Egypt, and for the bee that is in the land of Assyria, and they will settle on the steep ravines, on the ledges of cliffs, and on all the thorn bushes." So he says, you don't have to be afraid of these 2, but I'll tell you who you can be afraid of, Assyria. Be afraid of them, because they're going to come and they're going to devastate the land. And so that's really what he should have done. He should have trusted in the Lord, knowing that those 2 were not going to be a problem, that Assyria was. But instead, trusted in Assyria. He goes on to talk about how it's going to be a desolate place because of what Assyria does. And then chapter 8 comes. And so that's the sign that's going to happen. So as a reader, we expect now a child to be born of a young woman. In our translation, a virgin, but it means a young woman who would normally be a virgin at that age. Chapter 8, verse 1, "Yahweh said to me, take for yourself a large tablet and write on it in ordinary letters, swift is the booty, speedy is the prey. And I will take to myself faithful witnesses for testimony." And he mentions who they are, or who he is, Uriah the priest. "So I approached the prophetess, and she conceived and gave birth to a son. Then Yahweh said to me, name him Maher-Shalal-Hash-Baz, for before the boy knows how to cry out, my father or my mother, the wealth of Damascus and the spoil of Samaria will be carried away before the king of Assyria." So there's the child. That's the sign child that was born. And before that child grows up and knows the difference between left and right or good and evil, those kings weren't going to have any other sway in the territory. They were going to not even be a people anymore. But because Ahaz did what he did, in verse 5, he continued to speak, and he said, "But inasmuch as these people have rejected the gently flowing waters of Shiloah, and rejoice in Rezin and the son of Remaliah," in other words, they rejected me, and they were afraid of Rezin, these people that were really nothing. "Therefore, behold, the Lord is about to bring on them the strong and abundant waters of the Euphrates, even the king of Assyria and all his glory." And we read this earlier. He's going to come in and he's going to destroy almost all but Jerusalem. He says in the end of verse 8, he's going to spread the wings, fill the breadth of your land, O Emmanuel, which is God with us, the same thing that was mentioned in 7:14. "Be broken, O peoples, be shattered, give ear, all remote places of the earth. Gird yourselves, yet be shattered. Gird yourselves, yet be shattered. Devise a plan, but it will be thwarted. State a proposal, but it will not stand, for God is with us." He's talking to the Assyrians there. "For thus Yahweh spoke to me with mighty power and instructed me not to walk in the way of this people." So he goes on to talk further about how people should not consult mediums and spiritists, how they should just trust the Lord, that it's going to be okay. Sure enough, chapter 9 talks about this king that's going to come. He gets sort of into prophetic mode, and that's where "for unto us a child is born," all those kind of come in. And in chapter 9, he's really thinking about how there's going to be this righteous king in the future that's going to trust the Lord completely. Chapter 10 comes, and it talks about how Assyria is going to be destroyed. Okay, so that's sort of the backdrop. That's the foil that Hezekiah, who's going to be the main part of the book, is going to come in contrast with. Now, chapters 8 through 12, I mentioned there's going to be a coming righteous king who Assyria is going to be destroyed, and then chapters 11 to 12 is more messianic prophecies that talk about how this king is going to reign gloriously.
Is it fair to say then that Isaiah oftentimes kind of swaps between kind of his present historical situation and long-term messianic?
Absolutely. Yeah, so even in the introduction, which I didn't go through, but it talks about, first it gives sort of a just kind of high level, everything's destroyed, people are sinful. He talks about that, then he says, but there's going to come a day, the mountain of the house of the Lord, and he sees that, but then he comes back and says, well, here's where we are now. Even within a verse, we've talked about before, he'll say, Jesus came and fulfilled the first half of the verse, but not the other. So even within a verse, you'll see things like that, but certainly within chapters, he'll go back and forth. So the sort of where you're at after reading chapter 12 is we should trust the Lord, even when enemies are on our doorstep. When he gives us a promise, we should trust him. We didn't. That led to the Assyrian issue, but there's coming a king one day who's not going to do that, who's going to reign righteously, who's going to fully trust the Lord, a glorious king. Now, after that comes some of the harder chapters of Isaiah. Let's say chapters 13 to 35. We're not going to focus as much on them, but let's read at least a couple of these things. Essentially, 13 to 27 are sort of proclamations against the nations and how the nations are going to fall. And, again, the point of that, I think, for the book of Isaiah is God controls all that. God controls the nations. And so you don't have to be afraid of them and do put in your own strength try to figure things out. Trust me. And then he explicitly says that in chapters 28 to 35. Don't trust in the nations. Let's read just a couple of those verses so you can see that's really what Isaiah is calling the people to. Let's just do 31, 1 to 3, because we can also catch 6 after that. Woe to those who go down to Egypt for help and rely on horses, and trust in chariots because they are many, and in horsemen because they are very strong, but they do not look to the Holy One of Israel, nor seek Yahweh. Yet he also is wise and will bring disaster and does not retract his words, but will rise against the house of evildoers and against the help of the workers of iniquity. Now the Egyptians are men, they're not God, and their horses are flesh and not spirit. So Yahweh will stretch out his hand, and he who helps will stumble, and he who is helped will fall, and all of them will come to an end together. Now, all this is, again, setting us up for chapters 36 to 39, which is going to be about Assyria that's coming. And he's saying, don't trust Egypt. Don't look to Egypt for help. There should be a righteous king who fully trusts God, who doesn't reach out to others for help. Trust me. In fact, you can see in verse 6 of that same chapter, again, this very explicit statement from Isaiah to the people of that time, not to trust in others, but to trust in God as Assyria comes against them. Verse 6, return to him from whom you have deeply defected, O sons of Israel. For in that day every man will cast away his silver idols and his gold idols, which your hands have made as a sin. And the Assyrian will fall by a sword, not of man, and a sword not of man will devour him. So he will not escape the sword, and his young men will become forced laborers. So there you have it very explicitly. I will take care of the king of Assyria. Trust me. Okay? So now we have Isaiah 36 to 37, which is the story of Hezekiah. Now, the author, Isaiah, can't make it any more clear that he's contrasting Ahaz and Hezekiah. Read how he introduces the story in chapter 36. It came about in the 14th year of King Hezekiah, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came up against all the fortified cities of Judah and seized them. And the king of Assyria sent Rabshakeh from Lachish to Jerusalem to King Hezekiah with a large army. And he stood by the conduit of the upper pool on the highway of the fuller's field, which again is the exact same place that Isaiah and his son Shear-Jashub met with Ahaz before. Same words there. So he's setting up this story the same way he did Ahaz to show, here now we have a righteous king. And what will happen when the righteous king doesn't trust in Egypt, doesn't trust in horses, doesn't trust in man, but trust in the Lord. Right? That's how the story is getting set up. So, sure enough, Sennacherib in 36 sends that messenger to taunt the people that are on the wall and to say, hey, who are you trusting in? We've defeated everybody. I don't know who your trust is in, but you ought to just surrender to us. Hezekiah instead sends messengers to Isaiah and says, listen to what this king is doing. Please pray to the Lord for us and help us to be delivered. Sure enough, the continued sort of negotiation on the battle continues. Eventually, Hezekiah himself goes to the temple. He prays. I keep using the word messenger because they keep using the same Hebrew word, messenger, through all this to sort of show people are sending back and forth, and God is going to send his messenger to Hezekiah saying, I'm going to save you. I'm going to take care of you. And then God sends his messenger to Sennacherib, which is just an angel. It's the same word. He sends an angel, and he destroys 185,000 of them, and they're saved. And so there you have it. That's exactly kind of what we expect the book and how it's to read, because here you have Hezekiah as a totally different king than Ahaz, totally different, and he reacts totally different. He trusts the Lord delivers him. Surely this is the king of Isaiah 9, the one who's the government's going to be on his shoulders, going to reign in perpetuity, right? I mean, this is exactly what we expected from all these future-oriented prophecies of Isaiah. I mean, if you're living that age, you hope Hezekiah is the Messiah, based on what we see here. But let's look closely. That's the end of 37. But look at 38. In those days, Hezekiah became mortally ill. Now, in those days, in what days? It's not in the days that the Assyrians were outside the city. In fact, it's 15 years before that. And we'll see that in just a second. Let's read. In those days, Hezekiah became mortally ill, and Isaiah the prophet, the son of Amos, came to him and said to him, Thus says Yahweh, set your house in order, for you shall die and not live. Then Hezekiah turned his face to the wall and prayed to Yahweh and said, Remember now, O Yahweh, I beseech thee, how I have walked before you in truth and with a whole heart, and have done what is good in your sight. And Hezekiah wept bitterly. Then the word of Yahweh came to Isaiah, saying, Go and say to Hezekiah, Thus says Yahweh, the God of your father David, I have heard your prayer, I have seen your tears. Behold, I will add 15 years to your life, and I will deliver you in this city from the hand of the king of Assyria. I will defend this city. So this happened before Assyria was around them. And this, listen to this, this shall be the sign to you from Yahweh. He's going to give Hezekiah a sign, just like he gave to Ahaz, that Yahweh will do this thing that he has spoken. Behold, I will cause the shadow on the stairway which has gone down with the sun on the stairway of Ahaz to go back 10 steps. So the sun's shadow went back 10 steps on the stairway on which it had gone down. And then Hezekiah praises the Lord for rescuing his life and keeping him in the land of the living. But you see, all that happened before, and all that happened as a part of the people Assyria coming and surrounding the city. So Hezekiah, just like Ahaz, was afraid, rightly so. Assyria was a much stronger army than Syria and Israel. Rightly so was he afraid. He was sick. God healed him and said, Trust me, I'm going to save the city. Trust me. Don't go send to Egypt. Don't do anything. Trust me, I will deliver the city on my own. I don't need anybody's help. And that's what. And I'll give you a sign that I'm going to do this. And the sun goes backwards. And so surely it's very clear that he's going to do this. Plus, I'm sure he heard the stories of his dad. Okay, so Hezekiah praises the Lord for the rest of chapter 38. And then chapter 39 starts. And this is where the contrast between Hezekiah and Ahaz breaks down. And you can now compare them and not just contrast them, because they actually acted the same. Chapter 39. At that time, what time? The time of his sickness. At that time, right, which was also the time when Assyria was around the city. At that time, Merodach Baladan, son of Baladan, king of Babylon, sent letters and a present to Hezekiah, for he heard that he had been sick and had recovered. And Hezekiah was pleased, and showed them all his treasure house, the silver and the gold and the spices and the precious oil, and his whole armory, and all that was found in his treasuries. There was nothing in his house nor in all his dominion that Hezekiah did not show them. So Hezekiah is showing all his riches to the king of Babylon. Now, who was Babylon at this time? They were really nobody. They were really kind of thorns in the side of Assyria. They weren't the superpower that they would become. But what you learn, not from Isaiah, Hezekiah actually did try to pay the king of Egypt before. That's not in here. But what Isaiah is pointing out is Hezekiah, like his son, like his father before him, went to someone else and got in league with someone else to try to handle the people around. He didn't fully trust God despite the sign and everything that was given to him to encourage him to do that. All the prophecies of Isaiah. In fact, here comes Isaiah the prophet. Verse 3. He said to him, "What do these men say, and from where have they come to you?" And Hezekiah said, "They have come to me from a far country, from Babylon," which I've always felt, this is speculation, but I've always felt when I read that, it sounds to me like what they said in the days of Joshua when the Gibeonites came and they made league with them when they shouldn't. Well, they're from a far country. The bread was stale. They're not somebody that we need to destroy. They've come from a far country, from Babylon. And Isaiah said, "What have they seen in your house?" So Hezekiah answered, "They've seen all that is in my house. There's nothing among my treasuries that I have not shown them." So now Isaiah, unfortunately, has to give the same pronouncement to Hezekiah that he gave to Ahaz. He said to Ahaz, "Because you didn't trust me, now Assyria is going to be the problem, and they're going to destroy you. Even though you didn't have to worry about Israel and Syria, now your son's going to have to worry about Assyria." Well, now he has to give the same pronouncement to Hezekiah. And he says, "Hear the word of Yahweh of hosts. Behold, the days are coming when all that is in your house and all that your fathers have laid up in store to this day shall be carried to Babylon." So it's not Assyria you had to worry about. Now you got to worry about Babylon, and it's going to be your sons that have to worry about it. And this is where Hezekiah, if you read about him in Kings, and especially Kings, it says that he got really prideful as he was so successful. And it sounds prideful here. He's a great king, again. Every king has their problems. David had his adultery. Hezekiah had this. Uzziah was a leper because he sacrificed. These are all imperfect kings. That's going to be the point of this book. Hezekiah said to Isaiah, "The word of Yahweh which you have spoken is good." For he thought, "There will be peace and truth in my days." Which is a horrible thing to say, right?
Why does he say that?
Well, because he's all right, I guess. The best I can understand is, again, Kings talks about how he'd gotten prideful and the Lord left him to test him and to see what was in his heart. And we all have bad stuff in our hearts. And this was what was in his heart, apparently. As long as he made it through, he's fine. He's not worried about what's in the future.
So when you talked about Hezekiah not trusting the Lord, it was the fact that he was going to Egypt. It wasn't
both. So even Babylon, when it talks, so it doesn't say, and he gave money to Babylon, primarily because they weren't the power that they needed to be yet to do it. But this talk of coming and showing them all his gold, and it's kind of like entering into league with them.
Okay, that's what I wasn't understanding exactly, especially in light of the fact that they were a distant country. It didn't feel like they were threatening.
Yes, but although they are the ones that end up, of course, the Lord delivers them. But the reason Assyria no longer becomes a threat to them after the 185,000 are killed is because Babylon rises up and does that. And that's where chapter 40 jumps in. I didn't put all this up here. Chapter 40 jumps in, and it's the point here that it's not written, but what Isaiah intends us to understand is that Hezekiah, as different as he is from Ahaz, is in one sense not different. In the same way that David, as different as he was from Ahaz, was in another sense not different. All of them sinful, all of them failing to one degree or another. Solomon, and all his grandeur, failed himself. And so none of them can really bring in this everlasting peace, this eternal dominion of the kingdom. None of them can do it. So who can? Who can? That's right. And that's what 40 to 66 is going to be about. It's going to answer the question, who? Who can bring about this new covenant? Who can do that? Well, there's actually three people that are mentioned in the next three sections, and the Lord is at the background of every one of them. But there's three sections. They're set apart by a phrase that says, "There's no peace for the wicked." And so there's three sections. They're both 9 chapters each, and they all talk about different things that the Lord is going to do, in particular, who's going to do them. So first, after announcing that they're going to be carried off to Babylon, chapters 40 through 48 talk about how God is going to act in the future, and he's going to bring them back. And how's he going to do it? He's going to do it through Cyrus. And he names them ahead of time. Cyrus is going to be the one that brings them back from Babylon. And God's going to do that. And you're exactly right, Charles, that the Lord is the one who can do that. He can, in fact, the beginning, the first servant song is really about Israel. You heard about the servant songs in Isaiah? Who can be God's servant? Who can do that? Well, Israel is blind and deaf. They haven't been able to be the servant that they need to be in order to bring in God's kingdom. And just like us, I mean, even the church to some degree, we need the Lord to come here and lead us, right? I mean, even there's no one that's faithful enough to do that. Well, God can do it, and God can use Cyrus, a pagan king who doesn't even know him. He'll call him by name, and he'll bring his people home as part of his plan. So that's the first section here, 40 to 48. God is going to act. He's going to use not Israel. He's going to use a pagan king to get his people back, which is the next part of his plan. Second,
is that another similar situation where Persia is not really the world power at that point? Babylon is still.
So really, when Isaiah is making this, Persia's not even thought of really. Yeah, I mean, there'd just be an area that Assyria had conquered, but they're going to come over the span of 2 centuries, and they're eventually going to be the massive world empire. So next, not only is God going to use, who is God going to use to do this? First, he's going to use a pagan king that doesn't know him to do it. Second, he's going to use a different kind of servant. And that's what we mentioned earlier. He's going to use a suffering servant. He's going to use one that, as I mentioned, faithless Israel is going to be replaced by a new faithful servant. He's going to bring peace and deliverance through sacrifice. So it's going to be totally different. And God's going to use, and Charles is right, in real sense, this is God himself again. It's his son that he's going to send. And it's not clarified here. We don't know that. We just know there's going to be a servant that's going to come through sacrifice, and he's going to not only bring the people back to land, he's going to deliver them from the sin that is the thing that's keeping them from having an eternal kingdom anyways. In fact, we're going to see the main theme of the book of Isaiah is one word, and that's holiness. Holiness is the theme. That was in Isaiah's call, right? He sees the holy God. He can't stand before him. And that's the point. These kings, as great as Hezekiah was, he's not holy. He's not set apart and totally different. He's not consistent and faithful in everything. And that's what is needed. Somebody who trusts God above all else. Somebody who follows God above all else. And God's Son is the one who does that. There's going to be a servant who delivers Israel from sin. And then lastly, God himself is going to be the one that does the final step and deliver Israel, redeem Israel, and bring them back to glory. I can read chapter 59. So in each of the previous 2 sections, there were servant songs. And again, Israel was not being faithful as a servant. He was going to use a different servant, Cyrus, and then he's going to use a suffering servant. And then there's no talk of servant in the last 9 chapters. And the reason for that is because God himself is going to act. He's going to act on his own. Let me read 59:16 through 20 for you. Now Yahweh saw, and it was displeasing in his sight that there was no justice. And he saw that there was no man, and was astonished that there was no one to intercede. Then his own arm brought salvation to him, and his righteousness upheld him. And he put on righteousness like a breastplate, and a helmet of salvation on his head. And he put on garments of vengeance for clothing, and wrapped himself with zeal as a mantle. According to their deeds, so he will repay. Wrath to his adversaries, recompense to his enemies. To the coastlands he will make recompense. So they will fear the name of Yahweh from the west, and his glory from the rising of the sun. For he will come like a rushing stream, which the wind of Yahweh drives. And a Redeemer will come to Zion, to those who turn from transgression in Jacob, declares Yahweh. And as for me, this is my covenant with them, says Yahweh. My spirit which is upon you, and my words which I have put in your mouth, shall not depart from your mouth, nor from the mouth of your offspring, nor from the mouth of your offspring's offspring, says Yahweh, from now and forever. So God himself is going to act. He's going to put his spirit on people, and it's going to be something that never ends. And that's how who God is going to use to bring about this final new covenant. He's going to use a pagan king. He's going to use a suffering servant, who we learn in the New Testament is his son. And he himself is going to act and put his spirit on all his people, so that forever they have a covenant with the Lord and they live with the Lord. So that's what the remainder of that final section is about, as well as how God is going to restore them to glory and how he's going to make a new heavens and a new earth. So he kind of covers all that. But the primary thing is that God is again, through Isaiah, talking about who is going to be the one God uses to do that. Now, just briefly, because I know we're short on time, I want to talk about major themes. Again, there is one major one. And each of these we're going to find, like in Ezekiel, it's glory. Glory is the major theme of Ezekiel. And each of the four, in the same way they focus on a different area, they all have sort of a different major theme. And for Isaiah, it's holiness. So it's used 68 times, the word, in 66 chapters. Holy One of Israel is a title for God. Is used very rarely outside of the book of Isaiah, but is used a lot in the book of Isaiah. Again, we saw in chapter 6 the holiness of God and how he's separate from sin. But his holiness is also speaking of how, unlike any king or any people or any entity on earth, God is different. And he can do what needs to be done. He can exercise what needs to be done without failure to bring about the eternal kingdom, unlike any king can, even a great one like Hezekiah. Okay, salvation is another. That's what Isaiah means. Yahweh is salvation. There was salvation offered to Ahaz, salvation offered. And salvation, again, we think of it as salvation from sin, justification. But salvation means you've got enemies and you're saved from something. Often we think of it as being saved from God, from his punishment, from his wrath. But it could be the Assyrians, it could be the Syrians and Israelites. Deliverance from exile, deliverance from sin, and deliverance from sinners through the conqueror God himself. And Isaiah, as the prince of the prophets, he's the one that Paul quotes the most in the New Testament as saying, hey, all this salvation that he himself is going to bring, it's going to be for Gentiles too. It's not just going to be for Jews. I mean, that's really opened up in Isaiah. In Romans 15 quotes 4 different places. I don't think all are from Isaiah, where that's predicted. Jerusalem, again, that was the focus of Isaiah. It's the center of God's future kingdom. The location of the spared remnant, and really where Isaiah's prophecy centers around altogether. Okay, the sinfulness of Judah, the sovereignty of God, especially his, really if I were to, this was slides from before, if I were to, his omniscience in particular, his ability to know sets him apart from all idols. He knows the past. You know, that's always interesting to me. I think about, everybody's impressed when you can predict the future. There's really a lot about the past we don't know. All we know is what's been written or shared with us. There's a ton in the past we don't know and is lost to us. There's a ton in the present we don't know. Things that are going on we don't know. I mean, the future is just one aspect that we don't know. We don't know a ton. God knows it all. He knows what happened in the beginning. He knows everything that's going to happen in the future. He can predict new things that no one would expect. We used the joke last time. You know, I can say Georgia's going to beat Georgia Tech in football, and I'm not really predicting anything tough. But God can predict rivers and deserts and things like that no one would guess because he's so omniscient. Because he's omniscient. I guess you can't be so omniscient. Trusting in God, trusting in Yahweh and no one else is really important. And that's what the suffering servant's going to do. He's going to trust God even to death, which is not what Hezekiah. He got a little bit afraid and he didn't do it. Even David, a little bit of pleasure, a little, he didn't trust God. I mean, this suffering servant is going to trust God even to death, or as Philippians says it, even death on the cross. Purpose statement, as the holy God, Yahweh must punish those who rebel against him. And that includes, again, just not trusting him fully. Even people like Hezekiah. He's a holy God, but he's also, as a holy God, able to save. He's able to save and willing to save those who trust in him. And will, through both his suffering servant, through his use of Cyrus, and through himself coming and bringing salvation.